dang complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messing up.
All right, Kruptos. Welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
Good. Yourself?
I'm doing quite
Excellent,
well.
actually.
Yeah, a little bit under the weather, as you can probably tell, but mostly done with it, other than my voice sounding a little bit worse than normal. But I'm glad to have you on.
It's really good to be here.
So yeah, I actually we'd originally planned to do this episode live, but I have the time to do a sort of marathon recording session, so I'm excited to get this one done. And my plan, albeit one that I did not share with you, was to talk over an article you recently wrote about the culture war and the scope of disagreements. So do you want to provide sort of an intro to that article and what kind of primed you to write it?
Yeah, it's one of these things where you pick up bits. This was from a philosophy professor of mine in actually an intro philosophy classes. They were, as he was detailing all of the basic concepts of philosophy, you know, ideas like reification and others. And he introduced this idea of first and second order disagreements. And so it just occurred to me the other day that the culture war is really a second order disagreement. So a first order disagreement is one in which we all accept the rules by which the order is going to, the disagreement is going to be resolved. So there's either, you know, we study the science, or we look it up in the Bible, or we go and ask the shaman, or the Pope makes a ruling. But however it is within the community, there is an accepted mechanism that all of the members of the community have by which the dispute is resolved. And when it's resolved, somebody may not like it, they may feel aggrieved, and they may revisit it in the future. But once that declaration has been made, the dispute is resolved and the community can move on, right? So in a second order disagreement, though, you have a disagreement, but you also have a secondary disagreement in that you no longer have any agreed upon mechanism by which to resolve the agreement. So you can't say, well, we'll take it to the Supreme Court, because either one or both of the sides don't see the Supreme Court as legitimate, right? Or let's vote on it in the House of Representatives, but one or the other side no longer sees that vote as legitimating. We look it up in the Bible, but one or the other side no longer sees the Bible as legitimate. Let's take it to the Pope. Well, one of the other groups no longer sees the Pope as a legitimate source of authority. And so what happens is you have this dispute, but now you have no social mechanism for resolving it. And that's your second order disagreement. And that's where we're at today. And so we have these mechanisms of society that we're used to. So in democracy, the theory is like the marketplace of ideas, that you're supposed to have these public neutral forums, and you enter into these forums, and then you hash out the idea, and the best idea is supposed to win the day. And then once the best idea wins the day, then it's in theory supposed to be resolved. We either take a vote on it, you know, and then the person who is on the outs then accepts the will of the majority. And that's kind of how a democracy is supposed to work. And then the other mechanisms of dispute resolution that go along with it, things like Supreme Court and others. But by and large, this whole marketplace of ideas, democratic resolution of disputes. There has been some sort of ancillary ones too, where you have, you know, science, the dictates of science are out there. But the fact that you can see so many competing methods of resolution tells you that something is up, that there isn't really a cohesive cultural substrate whereby everyone accepts a single unifying legitimate, or one or two perhaps, unifying ways of resolving a dispute. And that's really sort of the essence of the culture war. And there are implications of that for down the road as it intensifies. Because I think this notion that we're going to put the woke away isn't really going to happen because of this. It just isn't possible anymore because there is no center in that. I got a tweet that I'm going to be, or thread that I'm going to be putting out, and maybe I can introduce your readers to some of the thoughts in that regard as well.
There's a lot to address there. I've been speaking more recently to more traditional conservatives, right? And one of the things you see in that is a longing to return to normal, right? To return to an era when we were primarily dealing with those, with those much smaller problems, right? The idea was where, we both agree on the same standard to decide, a dispute, right? And this is ultimately a question about sovereignty, right? Do both sides consent to sovereignty, right? Because
of the other,
according to Schmitt, right, sovereign is he who decides the exception, and that's really what this is about. And the problem, which you very astutely pointed out, is that the left no longer consents to the previous system of authority. Now, this is oftentimes placed at the feet of, MAGA extremists, quote unquote, non-bipartisan Republicans. But what we see in that, right, and this is something that Land has pointed out, this is something that, a great number of the neo-reactionaries have pointed out, that this is not a one-time compromise, right? You bring up in the article this point that, like, the way to resolve, this kind of true first principles conflict is either one side must bend, to the other's will, or they have to fight it out. Right. And the problem is, it's not a one and done thing with the left, right? You can't just say, like, all right, I've consented to X, now we can have a normal society, because of the nature of the left, right? Land talks about the left, one, as dialectic, right? It thrives in that, that kind of like ever increasing politicization of society, which means that it's not in their interest to let sleeping dogs lie, right? It's not in their interest to let there be a peaceful resolution. Well, and also, right, we know that the left is an entropic force, right? It is eating away at, the very fabric of society to keep that dialectic process going. And one of the things that I want to bring up, and we can go back to more of the core of your argument about the woke going away, is that if we imagine, ultra competent Machiavellians, putting the woke away is very much something you should do, right? It is the rational choice. But again, when I look at our regime, I see the competence in our regime dying and retiring, right? And the people behind those competent individuals, many of whom are late in their career, they buy into it on a level much, much deeper than the previous elite. And so to me, I 100% buy the premise that woke, whatever we want to call that, was a cynical ploy at one point, but sort of like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, right? It's like, well, okay, you can control it for a little bit, but that kind of catabolic, dialectic force, right? That need to politicize everything, that can get away from you very quickly. And it's very, very difficult to resolve a society in which so many things have been taken to that first order disagreement, when it is no longer kind of a unified society with differences, but it is two societies wrestling for control of an empire. Sorry, back to you.
Oh, no, and there are many layers to it, and it's surprising is once you read broadly and say somebody like Carl Schmitt, he really does. Probably his best book on this would be Legality and Legitimacy, or Legitimacy and Legality, whatever the order they two come in. Because in that work, he talks a lot about this notion of the unitary state and, the conditions for, he calls it for laying down your right to revolt. So when is a state legitimate and so forth? And he makes the case that, a democratic state largely can never have legitimacy because you can never actually achieve a unified state. So democracy itself doesn't achieve the unified state. And, if you look at democracy and the democratic institutions as a rational, closed system of rationality, eventually the whole thing is going to end up fragmenting or going to a dictator because it's not sustainable. And largely because it's not grounded on anything. So again, we talk about, so what is it that lends the democratic system its legitimacy? Is there something outside of that the system appeals to or is grounded in? So, for example, the example he uses is the marketplace of ideas. He says, well, the marketplace of ideas itself is never subjected to the marketplace of ideas. It's just accepted a priori that this is the way that the best idea emerges, is through the marketplace of ideas. And you never actually test it against it, or you never actually say, well, the marketplace of idea is grounded in this other idea, in the sense of, this is how God wants us to resolve disputes, right? So that it's not grounded on anything, or this is the way that it's been scientifically demonstrated through nature or whatever we can do tested. This is the way, that the best way to do. So it's not, and because it's not grounded on anything, a closed system of rationality, eventually it gets to the point where the disputes itself break the system. And that's what he argues, is that because you cannot create a unitary society out of a democratic institution. The democratic or the unitary society must precede the democratic institutions within which they operate. So as long as you have a unitary society that accepts these mechanisms as the best way to resolve disputes, it works, right? And so one of the reasons why Republicans are so bad at politics is they still accept the system as working. So the right and the Republicans, or what we would call the center, they will say, hey, we need to get all of this woke stuff off the table. Or conversely, and we can talk about the mirror of this, the religious right. We need to get all of this culture war stuff off the table so we can get down to the business of running the nation. And what they're saying is everybody needs to step back, and we need to accept the rules of the system as the system, and let's come to a compromise. Let's make an agreement, and then it will be settled. Right. The problem is with the left, with the ratchet, they don't accept that premise anymore. Today's agreement is merely a premise for getting the next step. And so you think that you've reached an agreement, and they're merely just one step towards their end goal, because it's never resolved. And the right continues to lose in the culture war because they don't accept the fact that the only response acceptable to this is to see that what the left is doing is not just a desire to implement the revolution, but it's an attack on the system itself. And they're looking to impose their own higher order on society, that they want to establish a unitary society based on their value system and sweep away the current value system.
Yeah, that's well said, right? I think that, again, one of the things that I find really frustrating in all of this is, the sort of residual libertarianism you see from Republicans. And, this kind of like live and let live attitude, I view as being in the same category as a functioning democracy. That is a luxury, right? That is something that you can pull off if you are a small, homogenous, virtuous population. But
when the system within which democracy is supposed to work works, libertarianism can make sense.
Right, exactly, because there are very, very few second-order conflicts, right? Everyone is on the same page.
We all agree on what the rules are, and now I can just kind of live and do my own thing.
Well, certainly.
And as long as those conditions, as long as those higher order conditions are accepted, libertarianism works, but it doesn't work as a first-order system to establish social order.
Because one of the things that you see with that luxury belief of democracy, of kind of cultural libertarianism, is that while that works in a high trust society, it creates the conditions for a low trust society.
It does.
And so I use this analogy quite often about parenting, right? That it is very obviously wrong to treat your toddlers as if they are functional adults, in the belief that, well, that will create functional adults, right? I'm treating them how I want them to act, in their end state. And so you see the same thing with low trust, dysfunctional societies that simply acting like how you would in a high trust society with, shall we say, cultural libertarianism, the idea that people should be allowed to do whatever they want with, representative democracy. It very clearly doesn't work. And you see this in the cases of places like Liberia, right, which was handed a carbon copy of the US Constitution. And don't get me wrong, the US is in pretty bad shape now, but it is still significantly better than Liberia has ever been, right? And it's because that was a low trust society, right? It didn't work. It didn't have the cultural underpinnings. And this is why I'm in general relatively hard on the Constitution. Not because I don't think it's a beautiful document, not because it doesn't resonate with me on kind of a bone deep level, but because there's so much behind that, right? There's so much that has to support a document like that. There's that kind of social cohesiveness. And when you don't have that, when you don't have a common agreement to authority, right? When everything becomes that, that order to conflict, where it is a fundamental disagreement, you can't have those sort of nice things.
No, that's right. And the American Constitution, like it was a beautiful experiment, but it really, there was sort of a sleight of hand that was done, right? So you have this kind of separation of church and state so that you can avoid the religious wars of the 16 and 1700s in Europe, between Protestants and Catholics, and between Protestants and Protestants. And so you're working to avoid this religious war. So you say, hey, we're not going to establish any particular Christian faith. And you can see this in the early constitutions of the various states, where, public office, it was required to be a Christian, but it didn't matter. They would very specifically say they didn't matter which Christian denomination you're from, as long as you were Christian, right? And so, but in that sense, by not establishing and stating outright what our faith commitments are, and saying that's really the realm of private belief, you're placing a great amount of trust that the culture will continue to provide not the foundation is not the right word. So the greater superstructure within which your system works. It becomes the ground within which the Christian culture becomes the ground within which basically a liberal system operates. And unless it's intentionally supported to say, hey, we need to be a Christian society for this to work, and this needs to be part of official policy that we are a Christian society, which was never really done. To say we didn't necessarily go the route of saying, well, we're a secular society like they did in France, but there was this sort of, that will be just the result, that'll be the purview of the private affairs of people, and we'll let them decide on which Christian church, which Protestant church they go to. We're not going to make it official policy, but we're just going to trust that our liberal state operates within a larger Christian framework. And every state requires some sort of religious grounding, and this is another thing that Schmidt identified. All law is based on morality, and all morality is based on some form of religious belief. There's some sense, whether it's ideological or whatever, but there is this some idea of, thus says the Lord behind it, whoever that Lord happens to be, whether it's, a desiccated religion in the form of ideology, or it's a religion proper. But that line between religion to morality to law is very, very clear. And so once that larger superstructure begins to break down through secularism, and once you no longer have a quote unquote official, something that says we are a Christian society, there's a vacuum that's created, and sooner or later something came to fill that vacuum. And it was largely left liberal progressivism, that idea that through technology and through science and innovation and through human progress, that we can fix our own problems, right? That's the big thing, is we can fix our problems ourselves. And that then becomes the new religion. And as that gets put into in the 20th century, this has been sort of the march, is to say, yes, we can fix our own problems. And so now you have a new religious belief, and the most extreme portion of that is wokeism, but there is really no center anymore. That because the larger superstructure is gone, once the belief in formalism erodes, so you have one group, the Republicans and the conservatives, and even you might say moderate centrists, the liberals who've been left behind. So you have those moderate liberals, moderate conservatives who still believe in the system, who still believe that it should work, but it's now a kind of formalism. So you get the David Frenches of the world. Well, we have to allow, what is it, queer story hour, because if we don't allow queer story hour, the system breaks down. We have to allow satanic statues in the state hall because everyone has to have freedom of religion. Otherwise, the system breaks down. So you're seeing these kinds of mindless embrace of formalism for the sake of formalism, but nobody understands how it's grounded anymore. And so they're panicking because there's a religious conflict breaking out over what's going to be the dominant grounding for society. And the people in the center are panicking because they have no idea of that they're not even playing the game anymore.
Well, and in addition to that, right, there's a panic both that they don't know how to play the game anymore, but there's also the panic, which is, secularism and neutrality is a lie, right? When you've built your whole identity on this idea of kind of like impartiality, like, oh, we don't have these sort of a priori beliefs. And then all of a sudden you look around and you realize like, wait. These people have true belief, right? These people have kind of principles that animate them, even if they're awful principles, right? That's incredibly disconcerting to someone whose principles are basically, we should be roughly pleasant to each other and enjoy this kind of like nursing home society we've created. And so I think that's where you see a lot of the bluster from, the IDW types, the rationalist atheist sphere, and why those people have been so fully left behind, right? That, there really is no real pretension to neutrality anymore. And I think that this is really interesting that, when I was speaking with Clavin about COVID, right? And one of the things that I think COVID revealed, right, is that every facet of society was quote unquote politicized, right? Which the more turned on, probably already knew, but it was a very clear object lesson, right? That this supposed, wise, august institution of impartiality, right? The science, TM, was very much downstream of essentially theological claims about how the world works, right? It wasn't this sort of, like purely rational machine. And, once you've accepted that, all of a sudden it's like, you're no longer debating as sort of, Tea Party era Republicans like Paul Ryan would about the kind of like facts and figures, number go up versus number go down. You're having an argument which is based fundamentally on faith. And so I think that's one of the reasons that politics has gotten so hot is that, this really isn't a policy debate. It is two religious factions. And admittedly, one of them is evil and one of them is stupid, by and large.
Well, and that's the way, and on the converse side, they have the same view of themselves and us. And you get, and this is like, we talk about the politicization of science, right? Well, if you look at science was a sense, the whole purpose of science in the scientific method in terms of, seeking the truth and answering questions was to set aside all of those larger metaphysical questions of what does it mean? What should I do with my life? How should I act? Who should I worship? And just focus on how do things work? How can we then make them work to our benefit? And so it's purely functionalism and utilitarianism. How can we harness nature? How can we make it work? How can we understand it? And then that gets applied to everything, right? So that kind of neutral, we're just trying to be utilitarian about science, and everything wants to be brought under the umbrella of science. But eventually what happens is somebody asks, well, how then should we live? So then you get exposed in this whole thing with COVID this question of, well, we have to follow the science. Well, that's not a thing with science. Science is supposed to be, quote unquote, amoral, without morals. It doesn't tell you what to do. That's the thing about science. It just tells you how it works. And then from there, you make a moral decision based on other belief systems on what to do with that knowledge, right? So now science is being asked to become a fundamentally religious system or ideological. And it's being brought into the realm of the political. And so it's being politicized because it's being asked to provide essentially moral answers of what should we do? Well, we should follow the science. Well, the science never tells you what to do. It can act as it's just data, and then your own set of religious beliefs are supposed to provide you with the answers now that you have this data. But now the science is providing this. So either, on the one hand, science isn't grounded in any religious belief and it just tells us how it works, or fundamentally science becomes a self-grounding religious system that then dictates, and then it's just purely politicized at that point, right? Because it's now fundamentally a religious system. And that's one of the transitions that has taken place, largely because in the quote unquote neutral sphere, there was no accepted religious system that would say, well, okay, you have all these guys scientificing and doing answers, but we have this religious system that says, well, maybe certain scientific questions shouldn't be pursued. And then once we know the answer, the religious system says, you're not going to do anything with that because that's immoral. And then it stands because it's bounded within a larger religious framework. And really the whole purpose of much of the Enlightenment was to shake off the confines of that religious system that said, no, you can't study that, and no, you can't do anything with it now that you've learned it, right? And so now once you've thrown off that religious thing, if you get to a point now where you have this pandemic and you need somebody to make a moral decision with the data of science, what should we do about it, right? The church might say, well, we should not be afraid. Our life is in Christ. Let's go minister to the sick, which is what the church has always done in these types of situations. But the science, quote unquote, then stepped in and became and began to take the place of the Christian moral frame. It becomes its own moral system along with progressivism. So this technical progressivism becomes the new religion. We can fix it through technical means. So now we're fixing not only disease and illness, but we're fixing racism, we're fixing poverty, we're fixing every problem we have through the science, and it becomes the means of, this is how we as a people are going to save ourselves. It's a functioning soteriology.
One of the things that I think is interesting, right? And I talk about civic religion all the time, because again, we are dealing with, a war of religious belief here.
That's
right. That one of the reasons I think that the progressives are so desperate. You see this desperation in, particularly like the Biden admin, how the coverage of that, of that admin goes, right? There's this dread running through all of it. And so some of it I think is performative, right? Like they really get off on being afraid of the chuds. You see this particularly around the Christian nationalism, quote unquote, debate.
Oh yeah.
But I think that one other part of it is that they got what they wanted. Their God is dead, right? Their progress, right? They got their hope and change with a man like Obama. They basically had their earthly Messiah. I mean, and you see this in the fact that there were these weird religious services going on in 2008, right? Where people were having these kind of like ecstatic visions about him. But what Obama was kind of on like a totemic level is he was the promised son of the Civil Rights Act, right? He was the promised son, right? The God King of 68, right? He's here. He's going to fix everything. And what happened? Absolutely nothing.
It got worse.
Exactly. Everything got worse. And so what I think you see with that desperation is this realization that from a certain perspective, their version of progress is dead. And I have conflicted feelings about progress more generally, right? I think it is entirely possible to live in a more technologically advanced way that we currently do, even if I don't necessarily believe in social progress per se. But when you have that mythology, right, of we are fighting racism, we are fighting, the Nazis within our own ranks, and you get everything you want. You have 8 years, you have a massive mandate, and at the end, what happens? Absolutely nothing. And I think that some of that fear, some of that terror comes from looking in and basically looking at your God, and your idol is crumbling. And so I think that's why we see a focus towards the outsider, right? We see a focus towards the chud to basically redirect that energy into punishing the non-believer instead of necessarily looking at that God, so to speak.
Well, it's interesting. Now here, I don't know how familiar you are with the thinker Augusto del Noce, but he highlights the process that happens here, right? So you have what you would call sort of the cultural center of the bourgeoisie merchant class, right? And then there rises the challenge of religious Marxism. This idea of we're going to sweep aside, or history will sweep aside the bourgeois order, and we will enter into an egalitarian period of the realization of the end of history, all of that, right? And so it's a messianic vision that directly threatens the bourgeois order. Well, the bourgeois order, being bloodless, adaptive creatures that they are, eventually they co-opted Marxism into itself, in part through the Cold War. And so they adopted the philosophical materialism of Marxism, but then basically domesticated its messianic vision in the notion of human progress, so that we would have technical progress and we would all work towards technical progress, but we're not going to sweep aside the present order. And so the Marxists were enfolded into the bourgeois order through the administrative state and through, sort of technical rational administration. So now what happens is the messianic spirit then is outletted against the enemies of progress. So who are the enemies of progress? So the revolutionary fervor of Marxism, instead of being directed at the bourgeoisie, who are the true enemy of the Marxists, a new enemy is found, and that new enemy is the traditionalist, who is in the way of progress. Right. So that then the Christian, the traditionalist, the Orthodox, the Orthodox Christian with his traditional beliefs in marriage and abortion and sexuality and all of these things, he becomes the obstacle. And you see this with, I think it was Robert Reich, with this idea that the human sexuality and free sexuality will free us from fascism and Nazism. So, Christianity basically gets associated with fascism, because and that's the whole fight against the bourgeoisie now becomes an anti-fascist fight. And so it all gets this energy channeled into, and even as it is shown to be not working, in a sense, you either have two choices. You can repent and say we were wrong, or you can step up your fervor. It's like the old biblical story of Elijah and Mount Carmel with the priests of Baal, right? Where Elijah's mocking them, and the fire from heaven isn't coming. And he says, maybe your God is sitting on the John, and he's just ridiculing them, right? Maybe you should cut yourself. Well, that's kind of the phase that the progressives are in, and you're in this basic religious conflict. And this is not a new thing, right? And so they're amping it up, but they have a very clearly defined enemy, and that is the traditionalist, and specifically the opposing religion, which is Christianity. And so that is where the revolutionary output gets, then is to squash the Christian, who is the enemy of progress. If we could just get rid of the Christian, then everything Obama was working for, then we could realize, because the Christian stands in the way of that. And a lot on the right don't really understand that, and they don't want to believe it, that the true enemy is not secular conservatism, or centrism. The true enemy to the progressive left is the traditional Christian.
And I think that one of the other things we have to acknowledge in this, right, is that shift outwards is an attempt to regain legitimacy. right? To bring the kind of center and center right back within the fold, to get them to consent to authority, right? Because then you have that sort of manufactured situation where it is, oh, we are the legitimate power versus domestic terrorism, right? Versus insurrectionists. And again, that is a way to increase buy-in to the system, right? To get people back, kind of into the fold. And I don't necessarily see that working in the ultimate sense, but it is a desire, I think, to return to, quote unquote, within that system, to return to first order disagreements.
That's exactly it. So somebody, and this is really what the progressive left is looking to do, is their goal is to establish a unitary society, right? Because that's what all societies want, is they want to have a unified society under a single cohesive religious vision. And so the progressive left, and this is why the woke will not get put away. The progressive left, their goal is to reestablish a unified society under their religious vision. So, and this is something that I was planning on tweeting about today, but we look at it, we generally tend to see the woke as the crazies, and everybody else is fighting against the woke. And that, I think, is a misunderstanding of the current dynamic. So there's this talk of, when you talk about the left, so you see that in Ronald Reagan, you see it in figures like James Lindsay and those two scientists, the Weinsteins, right? And others like him, the Jordan Petersons of the world, right? I didn't leave the left left me behind, right? So what they're basically saying is that we are centrists of the old order. Now, they're not, they would be left of center and right of center, but they're hearkening back to a world where left of center and right of center accepted the same overarching worldview in society. Now, in this case, it was just simply because they accepted no larger religious vision. It was just the formalism of the system itself as being self-grounding, right? So that's what the center accepts. So they're saying that the progressive left me behind. I didn't leave the left behind. And, Reagan said this, others said this. And what they're identifying is this sort of old center, and they're being left behind by this new religious vision. But we look at the progressives as really the sort of the problem, but there is a mirror on the other side that, Republicans should be saying this about the Christian right, in a sense that, the Christian right left me, or the right left me behind. I didn't leave the right, because you see it on both sides now. So there is this mirror function of the Republican Party is saying exactly the same things about the conservative and generally Christian right as the left is saying about the progressive left. And so you have this center that has been abandoned by two competing religious visions. And one or the other will reestablish a unified society. Either society will break up and you'll have two separate visions, or you'll have one cohesive whole because the one defeats the other. And that's the only way that this gets resolved. And that's the only way that the woke gets put away, or the only way that the Christian right gets put away, is that they are crushed. And the only way that the woke gets put away is that they are crushed. Or the two divide into two separate societies that then become warring societies against each other, much like old societies did.
Well, and that's why it is truly impossible to, quote unquote, return to normal, right? There's no going back.
Well, because the normal doesn't have a religious vision to bind it, because it was pure formalism. Right. And that's the real problem that the center has, is they have no religious vision.
Well, and we were coasting off of the fumes of a high trust unified society.
That's right.
And I think that's one of the reasons that people look at the baby boomer generation with such disdain, is that they basically were allowed to receive all of the benefits of a homogenous high trust society, while burning that capital and enjoying the kind of like fleeting benefits of the quote unquote open society. And what that's left us is sort of the worst of both worlds, right? Where we've really burnt out any kind of capital. We have vastly diverged on what it is to, be a, unified society. No one agrees on it. And so you're right when it comes to, there are really three ways out of this, right? One side, and pardon my language here, one side cucks, one side is destroyed, or we leave and we separate. And
that's right.
My problem with the separation is, one, the geography of that would be a mess.
Oh, yeah.
Although I will say people are sort of self-segregating, which is an interesting story in the US.
Well, and people migrations happen all the time, right? That with wars and conflict.
Right. So maybe that's a foreseeable option. But the problem is, right, again, and this goes back to Aaron McIntyre's point, that the side that wants to win will always beat the side that wants to be left alone. And I mean, you see that very, very clearly in sort of the most egregious attacks on the right in America. When I think of the sort of PatCon stuff in the 80s and 90s, right? Ruby Ridge, things like that. That, as long as these people have power, they enjoy going after their enemies. And I think that that's something that even if you don't personally, listener, have that trait in you, even if you don't want to go around sort of, punishing your enemies, they do. And that's what politics is, right? Politics is rewarding your friends and punishing your enemies. And the idea that the reward, the end goal in politics, is merely to be left alone. You're being sold a bill of goods. You are deliberately selecting for loser politicians by asking for that. Land has this idea that the thrifty politician, or we could say, the libertarian politician, is sort of a evolutionary dead end, right? That means he's bad at his job. He will be eliminated quickly by the system. And again, I don't say this out of some kind of triumphalism. I'm not happy, that we're in this situation. But fundamentally, right, and you mentioned, the death of ideology. It's like, well, do we look at the world as it is or how we want it to be? And the ideology that, conservatives have been given, because it really is not a contiguous tradition. It is a fake outgrowth, of a certain time in American society. Baked into it assents to the authority of the left, and they do not assent to yours. It is not a fair, it is not a symmetrical relationship. And so the reason I harp on these issues, Kruptos, and you know this, but I'm just speaking to my audience directly here, is not because I dislike you. It is not because, I look at you with disdain. But what good do your principles do you if you lose, right? Because again, we are not in a situation where you can compromise. It is not on the table. You either give up everything, you're destroyed, or you go somewhere else. And I don't look at two of those as particularly pleasant options.
No. Well, and I think when you break it down, there's a number of concepts that kind of float around and labels. One is the boomer con, right? So, and that's that person, as you say, that enjoyed that golden period of social breakdown when the broadly Protestant society, all of the social order kind of held on for a generation and a half, and they got to live and just do what they want while everybody behaved as if they were church-going folks towards each other, but they basically just left each other alone to just do whatever they want and so forth. And then social breakdown came, and there's no community structure left anymore to reel it in because it had all been broken down. So you have the boomer phenomenon, but I think there's also a similar like boomer lib phenomenon, and they're basically the same people. And this is why like mainstream Republicans embrace like the Weinsteins and the Weiss and all of these other folks who are left behind liberals, is because they're basically the same person. They're trying to man the center in that regard. But the thing is with the center is that there's a lot of money and power still there. There's a lot of prestige still there. So you have all the university sinecures, there's the art museums, there's, the symphony, there's all of the, there's the think tanks and all this kind of, there's this whole architecture built around the center of society where a lot of status, money, and all of the rest of that goes, right? The low status presents, and now the left has had far more influence on the Democrat Party than the conservative, maybe because the conservative right is a newer phenomenon, but in some sense, the woke, the really woke, although it's becoming more status, but the woke is really kind of a low status thing that's bubbled up from beneath. These are the religious crazies, the smart people, the wizards of the wizards of policy or whatever. They're looking to contain them. The Weinsteins and the Weisses and the Petersons of the world they're working very hard to contain these people to maintain this old liberal order. But that really is, you could probably still call it, you have the Boober Con and the Boomer Lib, and on either side of that center with all that money, power, and prestige is and sort of relative laxity is these two religious factions on either side, which is the religious left and the religious right. And we talk about wokeism, but we really should talk about it now as kind of the religious left and the religious right. And these two factions are now battling for creating a unitary society, one built around the technical management of all of society towards equality, that sort of woke religious vision, and the other is by and large a reestablishment of Protestant Christian dominance in North America. And that's your two factions. And then you have like the Boomer Libs and the Boomer Cons in the middle.
Well, and one of the things that I think is interesting to bring up, right, in this topic of religions, right, or national myths, whatever you want to say it, is that America has had several, right? The French number their republics. I think if we really drill down, we could number our religions. Look, Kruptos, I have 4 ideas. Let me recycle them, please.
Yeah.
It's fine. This is off topic. But someone asked me for a reading list. And I'll get back to this. I know what I want to say. Someone asked me for a reading list on Twitter, right? And, I put up all my books. I will say I'm supposed to do 12. Skipped number 6, so there are only 11. But point is, and at the end, I just said, this is the list that demystifies my show, right? If you read these 11 books, you've got it. That's pretty much everything I say comes from these.
You can stop listening, but don't.
Yeah, right. Like, you save yourself the effort, right? But I will say, one of the things that's really fascinating about one of those books, and a man that I recently talked to, Paul Gottfried, right, is he talks about the American political religion as anti-fascism. That particularly since World War II, right, when America became a global empire, its religion has been anti-fascism, right? Yes. The way that America dealt with the USSR was to cast them as the Nazis, right? You see this in Rocky, right? When Rocky fights Khal Drogo, what does he look like? Does he really look Russian, or does he look like a 6'4", blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan, right?
Yeah,
exactly, right. That's the kind of tone we're taking. You see this in kind of other parts of pop culture as well. And I think what we're seeing is a definite shift in public religion. Because don't get me wrong, right? The underpinning is still very much anti-fascist, but the framing is very different, right? The framing has gone from kind of appealing to what we could consider kind of like average Americans, like, oh, you need to take up your arms to fight against the fascist menace, and become this sort of like, you are the fascist, right? And this rainbow coalition. And that's a different, but still very related religion, right? Both of them are framed in this kind of like anti-fascist Freudian sense. But what's interesting in that, right, is that the complexity of that religion is really breaking down into just pure ethno-narcissism, right? So we look at something like BLM. And don't get me wrong, BLM has transnational financial interests backing it, right? We know this. The Open Society Foundation donated a lot to BLM. There are any number of groups who've put a lot of money behind it. And a lot of those people do have what we consider anti-fascist priors, right? But if you look at on the ground, that religion has basically just become, stuff for me and mine, right? Just pure down the line ethno-narcissism. And so don't get me wrong, there's always an element of that to human politics. That'll never go away. But what's interesting is that the new Americans, both in the sense of new arrivals and in just Gen Z people, do not have the same attachment to that founding anti-fascist myth anymore, right? You see that in the fact that, you know, the amount of young people who believe that the Holocaust, which I should say on air, I believe every narrative about the Holocaust, say that it is in some way exaggerated, is significantly higher. Now,
Yeah.
don't get me wrong, I'm not actually making a point about the Holocaust in particular. What I'm saying is, right, that myth is floundering. You know, the new arrivals don't believe it. And so I think that in addition to a legitimacy crisis, right, which is very, very real, we're also seeing a belief crisis, right? Like, how many of these people actually believe it? And I think what you see in, you know, the irony leftists, right, BreadTube, our kind of mirror image, it doesn't seem like any of these people believe it, right? They're dripping in irony. And the idea is that if you're in any way sincere about anything, that's laughable, that's a joke. And I think it's because their God is dead. Their God is dead and they know it. And the only thing pulling them forward is what Toynbee would call being a dominant minority, right? They're in charge. They're no longer creative. They no longer have a deep-seated belief in their cause, but they're in charge. And so really the only thing pushing them forward is just pure destruction, pure wealth transfer, effectively.
Yeah, see, I think like that cynical left that looks to harness the power of the woke against their enemies, they're still hoping, I think, and this is where you get the idea that the woke can be put away, that they look at the woke like a political tool that's in their toolbox to maintain their power and hegemony in the world. I mean, the rooting of this goes back, like as you say, I think for your viewers that don't necessarily understand that, you know, what is it about fascism that freaks people out, right? Well, it's this attachment to ethnos, you know, blood and soil, right? So blood, soil, and religion. So this idea that arose, so community breakdown has been happening since the 1700s, and there was, you know, waves of community breakdown resulted first of all in, you know, the revolutionary era in France and America. But the revolutionary era was already the beginning of a kind of social breakdown of your attachment to basically your little community, your little valley, your little principality, that little fief where you knew everybody, your 2 or 3 villages around which your life revolved, up to the nation. And once you had broken down the villages enough that you could harness this idea of the nation and the nation state, there were those that realized that the nation state was a very, very powerful thing, because a lot of these people who were in different villages still had a very strong ethnic connection to a very strong tie, you know, blood, spiritual tie to them. And following World War II, the elite class looked at that and said, well, this whole nationalist thing is very, very frightening. We need to break that down. So they began the process of breaking down nations, much in the way that communities and individual communities were broken down to create nations. And so now you're breaking down nations to create a global community. So you get the United Nations, you have the notions of global trade, but then also the free movement of global people. And our elites still, many of them operate within this realm of a kind of dispassioned transnationalism, in which we will prevent the kind of conflicts that happened in World War II by being deracinated, you know, technicians of this new scientific managerial world order. They never say it quite like that, but that's basically how it works. So you get at the top of the things, they don't believe in anything. There's no, it's purely formalism. They don't believe in any higher moral order other than the establishment of this global technical system of trade and governance. And it really works through, you know, policy and the administration of policy through the administrative state. And, you know, people are completely fungible. You move them around wherever you need them. If you have, you know, you're not making enough babies here, take them from the place that's making babies, bring them over here. That'll solve that baby making problem over there. And at the side benefit is that we break down all of these ethnic barriers that are the cause of wars anywhere. Get people living together and we'll be kumbaya. We'll have global peace. And we're still living in the after effects of that. Now, within that, you have all of these cynical operators who don't really believe anything, are very wry and detached and so forth. But there is now a rising up on the side, because in some sense, you need a religious movement. So once it got stirred and once this progressivism got going, now you're seeing this revival of, Marxist, what do you call it? The utopian Marxism again, but through the instrument of the administrative state. So these woke movements from the universities, from everything, are now taking over the administrative process and implementing their vision. And you have all of these, what you might call, like, for lack of a better term, sort of like the boomer libs, who are building this new world order. They're thinking that they can harness this to maintain their power. But they don't want to necessarily accept and become part of the religion. So yeah, they're cynically allowing it to happen, hoping that they can put it away when the time comes. But I remain skeptical about that, because you can only operate without a religion for so long. And now you have, disaffected people who have been left out, are turning to their real religions, and looking for, to be recognized as the foundation of society. And so I think we're moving towards a system of greater and greater religious conflict rather than less so, largely because you're bringing all of these people together into global systems. That's the other dynamic of people movement, is that people that used to be far away from each other and their different religions were operating on the other side of the globe are now being brought together everywhere. Like the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is now global, because you've brought Israelis and Palestinians everywhere. And so now they can take their fight, rather than leaving it in the Middle East. It's now in England, it's in New York, it's in Paris, and so forth.
So
and it's exposing some of the contradictions on this sort of dispassionate managerialism at the very elite level.
Well, I mean, and you see that even in, the actions of, the global American empire on the Russia-Ukraine front, right? Which I think it is no accident that a certain number of Ukrainian, descendants of Ukrainian immigrants end up in the State Department pursuing a punitive foreign policy against Russia, right? Like, you see this, and conservatives got very, very mad when Ilhan Omar basically said, like, oh yeah, I was elected to pursue Somalian interests, right? And it's like, oh yes, of course. Right, she was very
Canada's
clear about
finance minister, Christina Freeland. Canada's finance minister is Ukrainian.
Well, right, and so to me, that's sort of late empire stuff, right? That the problems of the colonies come home, and I think that's something we're going to see more and more of. But Kruptos, we're almost out of time, and my weak voice is going, so I'm going to have to tap out. But if people want to find more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Well, all of my serious stuff happens on my Substack, seekingthehiddenthing.com. You can just Google it, www.seekingthehiddenthing.com. There is some paywalled stuff, largely because it helps with my wife. This writing and so forth takes time away from the family, and it makes her feel better about it when there's at least an honorarium coming in. So I do appreciate everyone who does subscribe and supports that. But that you can find there, and you can also find me over on Twitter @_Kruptos, and that can be a little bit more loose and fun and irreverent. I mean, I think that's kind of the attitude of Twitter anyways, but that's basically where you can find me.
Well, certainly. And I will link the article we were referencing down in the description. I highly recommend that to everyone. And as far as my stuff, you guys can find me on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I am also on Substack, although I have been neglecting it for the past week and a half. Deeply sorry about that. And if you want to support me most directly, you can do that by checking out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Again, a little bit under the weather, so I've had to pull back on the gym. But
you sound fine, by the way, Jay.
Oh, okay, good. That makes me feel better. But I will say the current workout rotation is quite good. I'm enjoying it a lot, and thanks to JD for that. And again, Kruptos, thank you so much for your time.
A pleasure to be on, Jay. Thank you very much.
And everyone at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.